Good morning, everybody. It's my face again, Kia Sangria, and I want to thank you so much for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time seeing me, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below so that you can see more videos from me in the future. So right now I am in the middle of making a corset, and we are working on Simplicity 1345, which is this pattern here. I've been working on making View D, which is this style right here, and this is part 2 of that video. So if you have not watched part 1, I do suggest you go ahead and do that now. That way when you come back to this video, you'll know what's going on. So far, this has been a pretty easy pattern to use. I have previously made a corset using a commercial pattern before, and in my first video about making corsets, I kind of talk about thoughts and opinions on commercial patterns when it comes to corset sewing. I know that not every costumer is into that, and that's totally fine. That's your business. Over here, we like them, and so we are working off of a pattern that you could probably easily pick up in like your local Joann's or Walmart or on Etsy, which is actually where I purchased my pattern. So I'm not going to ramble for too long. We're just going to go ahead and pick up right where we left off. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments for me when it comes to the creation of this corset, go ahead and leave a comment down below on this video or leave a comment down below on the last video, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you guys may have to help you make your own corset. Let's go ahead and get back into this project. All right, welcome back to the sewing table, everybody. So at this point, we have finished the outer layer of the corset, and there it is on my Dritz mannequin. So what we're gonna do now is everything we did for the first layer, we're gonna go ahead and do for the lining pieces. And we're gonna just get all of these pieces sewn up together the same way that we did the outer layer of the corset. But before we get started, I have changed my thread, so we're going to be using pink thread now. And if you would like to know how to thread your machine, I do have a video on how to do that. Just check back a couple of videos prior to this one. I am also going to be switching the pins that I'm using. I will be using these brass dressmaker pins. These are perfect for very lightweight fabrics, such as this Poly China silk here that we're going to be using for the lining. So if you would like to know more about pins, I also have a video for that, and you can take a look at that on my channel as well. Okay, so now we have finished sewing the lining the same way that we did for the corset. This is what it looks like. So just like with the main piece, I'm going to go ahead and press all of the seams flat. That way we can attach both layers together. So I'm just currently waiting for my iron to heat up. And I have it on the wool/silk setting because this is a poly China silk. It's very delicate and I don't want to burn it. Okay, so I have now pressed out the seams for the lining. So here's a close-up of what that looks like. And what we're gonna do now is just some cleanup of cutting out loose threads and frays and stuff like that before we close this up, just because even though it's going to be hidden in the inside once you put the lining on, it just makes the project a lot more neat when you go ahead and just snip off like any loose threads hanging from your fabric. So we're going to do some cleanup and then we are going to sandwich the lining and the outer layer together so we can start sewing the channels up to prepare for the boning installation. Okay, so I have now pinned the lining to the outside, and I've pinned the lining inside of the corset with the wrong sides facing wrong sides, so that way we have the outside that's nice and pretty, and then inside it's nice and smooth. But there's no like fraying threads or raw edges in the inside. So I have pinned all of the seams together, and so I'm just going to sew straight down each seam on both sides to form the casing for our boning, or rather our boning channels to insert the boning next. When it comes to inserting boning with corset making, I think there's like plenty of options for you to use in terms of boning. I tend to use polyester boning, which is this right here, just because my corsets are made for costume and cosplay purposes. They're not really to give like a cinching effect or the effects of like traditional corsetry. I use these for costumes. So I tend to use this, which is basically plastic boning, and it works really well. I have two different widths here. So as you can see, like this one is thicker than this one. And then I also use zip ties. I find zip ties are also pretty effective for helping me build the look that I want. So just some zip ties from my local hardware store. I think for this corset here, I will be using zip ties. But if you're at home watching this and making a corset, then you can use whatever else you have available to you. I find out of the options that I have, it's really easy to get some zip ties from your local hardware store. So if you don't have polyester plastic boning, you can just probably go into your dad's or husband or boyfriend's toolkit and just grab some zip ties. I'm sure he won't be too upset with you for doing so. So before we get to that though, I'm just going to go ahead and start sewing the boning channels on the corset here. Okay, so I've just finished sewing all of the boning channels, and for a few of those channels I have already inserted my zip ties. So this is what they look like inside of the channel casing. And here's what the inside looks like once I've put in some of those zip ties as the boning. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim it a little bit, because if I leave it as long as it is now, as you can see, this piece is too long for this channel. But also we're going to be putting bias tape upon the upper edges of the corset, so the boning itself needs to be a little bit shorter than the channel, just so that we can comfortably sew the bias binding to the top of the corset and the bottom of the corset, while making sure that our needle does not strike any of the plastic boning here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish inserting boning into these two channels, and here you can see the difference. You see how flat that looks here, but for these, you know, you can clearly see that there's boning in them. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish putting boning in these two channels, and then I'm going to go in and cut some of the boning off. That way we can properly close the channels up before we put on our bias binding. Okay, so now all of the boning channels have their boning. So this is the outside of our corset, and then this is the inside. So I'm gonna work on cleaning up any stray threads in a moment, but what I'm going to do first is to prepare to install the bias binding along the top of the corset. I'm just gonna do a straight stitch all the way across the top and then the bottom, just to keep the layers together smoothly, and then we'll go into attaching the bias binding to close up all of the raw edges around the top, the bottom, and the sides of the corset. Okay, so now I have sewn the top and bottom of the corset as well as the side. So what I am going to do now is I am actually going to insert some boning on this edge here with the back piece folded over, and this is to basically add a little bit more structure to the back, because this is what's going to help us comfortably close the corset. So what I have done now is I've already pinned a channel for the boning, and I'm just going to insert a zip tie into this section, and then I'm going to sew down the side. So that way I am just locking the boning in place. That way when we attach the bias binding, it'll close up the top and the bottom of the channel. If this doesn't make sense, don't worry, I'm going to show you why it all comes together like this very soon. So for both ends, I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll come right back to show you guys the next step. Okay, so I have switched to using a zipper foot, so this will ensure that we are stitching as close to that boning as possible without striking it with our needle. Okay, so I have stitched the casing for the boning on the, I guess I'll just call this like the back section of the corset. So the boning is already inserted, and just like for the others, I have cut it down so that we have space to sew our bias binding on the top and lower edges. So this pattern does come with a pattern block for binding, but because my corset is made out of scrap fabric that I had from previous projects, I did not have enough fabric to make the bias tape, so I just went ahead and ordered some bias tape. This is the one that I got. You can find this at your local craft store like Walmart, Joann's, or any mom and pop shop that you have around. You can also order this from Amazon too if need be. And this bias tape comes in tons of different colors and tons of different widths. So I ordered some, I think this is about 1.5 yards. About 1.5 yards, and it comes with like 3 yards of bias binding, which I think is plenty for this project. And the color that I picked up, I think it's called rose pink. I'm not 100% sure what they call this color, but it's pink, just something to match this. So what I'm gonna go ahead and do is I am going to actually seal up this raw edge first before we do the rest. So I'm gonna start with like these little sections here just to make those neat. This is a double fold bias tape, so I don't know if you guys can see, but it's folded here. And basically what happens is that when you put this on the raw edge of anything, the raw edge gets enclosed in the tape, and that way your project no longer has raw edges. They're all encased inside the bias binding. It just makes everything look so much better. I'll insert a project in which I recently used bias binding. I think this is one of the most helpful things you can have when it comes to making a corset. It's so much easier to buy bias tape than it is to make it. But if you're into that and you're up for the challenge, you could always make this too. And there's tons of tutorials out there on like how to do this. I personally prefer to buy my bias binding. I just love to save time that way. So I'm going to go ahead and start applying this to the raw edges here, and I'll show you guys how I get started with installing this into my project. Okay, so the easiest way that I have found to attach bias binding is to just kind of enclose it over the raw edge that you're trying to cover and then pin it into place. So I am going to use my Wonder Clips to do this step. And the idea is that when you sew, you catch the raw edge of your project in the bias tape and it just seals everything inside. Okay, so now that I have pinned my bias binding to the back corset pieces, I'm going to go ahead and start stitching this down. But before I do, I want to make a point. Another reason why you might want to make your own bias binding is so that way you can be sure that when you attach the binding to your project, it actually matches the fabric. In this case, the pink that I picked out is a lot lighter than the fabric that I'm using, but because this corset is really just for YouTube and for the sake of this video, I don't mind that it doesn't match. I will use this corset for costuming purposes, of course, because I put a lot of hard work into it and I'm proud of it, but just wanted to make a point that this is probably the reason why you would probably want to make your own instead of buying it. You can have good luck with matching the project to the bias tape that you buy in stores. That's always a possibility, but if not, you can always make your own and then you're sure that it's going to match. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this through my machine, and then I'll proceed with attaching the bias binding to the rest of the project. That way we can move on to the final step. Okay, so we are in the home stretch of this corset. Just like I did for the inner part of the back, I have attached the bias tape to the top of the corset. This part will take you some time just because you have a lot of curved edges to go over. I'd say the trickiest part is the center of the corset, where there's a separation between the bust. The pattern that we're using does suggest making a dart in the center, and then that little space is covered up with a decorative bow. Now you can go ahead and do that if you intend to have some type of decoration in the center. I am still not 100% sure if I will be doing that, so what I decided to do is, before putting this in the machine, I decided to tack down the center here just to keep everything together, because that is a very tricky section to sew. And then I'm just going to sew over the part that I tacked. But with attaching the bias tape, you will have to fiddle with it a little bit. My goal was to just make sure that the stitches that I made to hold everything together, my goal was to just make sure that it would be covered up by the bias tape, and I'm really happy with how that turned out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to slowly stitch the bias binding to the top of the corset, and then we'll proceed with doing the exact same thing for the bottom edge as well. Alright everybody, so we are almost done with this project. Now the upper edge and the lower edge of the corset have their bias binding. The inside piece has its bias binding. So we are going to move on to the last step, which is to insert our closure pieces, which we will be using some grommets, which I keep mine in a bag here. And the pattern did include a placement guide, so we know where to mark our holes. So if you've never used grommets before, you've probably seen them on corsets that you previously owned, but they're also used in curtains and many other things. And they look like this. So there'll be two small pieces. Basically, one is like a pipe looking thing, and then the other is just this flat circle here. And the way that these work, I'll try to show you on camera, is that the piece that has the pipe will have the ring portion slid on top of it, and then you'll use a device that'll press the outer edges of the pipe here and make them flat. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. There are many different ways to install grommets. I previously used the hammer method, which I am not a fan of because it's just loud and really obnoxious to me. And then there's using one of these handheld grommet punchers. So I'm just going to show you what happens when using the grommet puncher. So the flat part of the piece that has the pipe on it, you're going to put it into this section here. And if you have one of these, you'll notice there's a groove here. And you'll just put this into the groove. And then this top portion here, when you press this inside, it's going to flatten it. So I'm going to try to show you guys what that looks like on camera. You do have to use a little bit of force, but then after you should get something that looks like this. So the way that this works with our project is that in between these two pieces would be our fabric. And so this is what would sandwich it in the fabric, and you would get a grommet to put your corset lacing through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark all of the placement portions on the corset, and then I will go ahead and start showing you guys how I get these inserted into the back of my corsets. Okay, so I have just used some black tailor's chalk to mark out my placement holes. It won't be visible to you guys, but I can see it very clearly on my end, and I used black so that I could see it clearly as opposed to using white tailor's chalk. So in order to remember where my markings are, I'm going to use an owl, which is this device right here, and this is used for poking holes in fabric. This is what I commonly use when it comes to making corsets and putting in the grommets. It's just a lot easier. After using the owl, I will sometimes go in with an X-Acto knife to kind of just make the hole a little bit bigger. So I use these together normally when making my corset. So for right now, I'm just going to use this here so that I can mark out my holes for myself for later. Okay, so I have already started installing some of the grommets, and I've got one side of the corset done, and so I just have 3 more to do on this end. So I'm going to show you guys in real time how long it takes me to do this by hand. It can be a little difficult. This is probably my least favorite part about making corsets. It's the installing of the grommets, just because it's so time consuming and it's such a delicate process. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started on showing you guys what this is like for me. That way you know what to expect when you decide to make a corset of your own. So like I mentioned before, I had already made holes inside of the corset, so I'm just gonna go back with the owl and just kind of find those holes. And what I'm gonna do is I'm going to open them a little bit wider so that we can get the grommets through. The thing about this is that you want to be really careful when doing this, because if you make a hole bigger than your grommet is just going to fall right out during wear. So this is really, really important, and it's a very, very delicate step. And it's basically the difference between making or breaking this project, because if you damage one of the holes when inserting your grommet and you know the hole is bigger than the grommet, there really is no way to go back and fix that. So we have to be very, very careful when doing this. So I'm going to take the X-Acto knife and I'm just going to open up that hole a little bit more. Again, being very careful to not make it too wide. And if I want to gauge it, I will use a pen and try putting a pin through the hole to see if I can get it through. So in this case, the pen is not getting all the way through, so we're going to go back with the X-Acto knife and just make the hole a little bit bigger. Okay, this seems really good. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to set up my puncher on the side here that we placed the flat disc on top of. I'm just going to put it on there, and unfortunately I can't show you guys on camera right now, but this little disc has 2 sides, one that's really smooth and curved, and then the other one kind of bends up a little bit. So the side that bends up, that's the side that you want facing up when you put this onto the puncher, because what's going to happen is that when you insert the grommet, this bottom piece is basically going to hug the fabric in between the hole, and that's what's going to sandwich that grommet in place. So I've set this up. I'm just going to leave this right here, and it's doing pretty good in there. So I am just going to take this part, which I don't know if you guys can see it, but this tip here, and I'm going to insert that through the hole. And then after that, I am going to take one of the grommet pieces, which is the piece that has the little pipe inside, and I'm going to put that with the pipe piece down on top. And this will take some fiddling with, but once you get it, you're fine. Okay. And once you have those pieces right on top of each other, you can go ahead and just squeeze the puncher. And that'll set your grommet into place. Now, you may have some fabric on the end here. Basically what this part does is that it moves the fabric out of the way. You can take like a little pin or something like that and just move it out of here. But as you can see, that's how you get the grommet inside of the corset, and that's how you make clean holes for your lacing to go through. So we have 2 more to do, So I'm just going to go ahead and do those two, and you guys can watch me do that. And if you have any questions about any of the steps in this video or the last one, please be sure to just leave a comment down below. I'll be more than happy to help you. Okay guys, so with that, I have just finished installing the last grommet onto this piece. So we are done. It's complete. This is the back with all of the grommets installed, and this is the front. So that's it. This has been how to make a corset, and we used Simplicity 1345. Technically the view we went with was view D, and this is my interpretation of that style of corset. So it laces in the back and it doesn't have a busk in the front. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do a fitting with this corset piece, and then I will be back to give you guys my outro and my final thoughts on this pattern. All right, everybody, so we are all done. Our corset is now complete. That was quite the project for me, especially because it's very early in the year, but I really had fun making it. I do have some thoughts about this pattern, things that I think you should know, things that I would probably change the next time that I make this. So first things first, one of the things that I didn't care for about this pattern, I'll start with the things that I didn't care for first. I know that's probably weird, but I think that some parts of the instructions could have been a little bit more clear. Specifically when folding over the back piece to make the section that your grommets are going to go through. There's really no kind of talk in the pattern about finishing it, and so that's why I decided to put bias binding on the edges, because I looked at the instructions and I noticed that that wasn't actually there. This pattern does not come with finished garment measurements. Finished garment measurements will really tell you, based on which size you pick, it'll tell you how the garment should fit after everything has been sewn together. And this pattern doesn't have that. And I think that's a really, really important thing to have when sewing a corset, because obviously a corset is meant to be smaller than your regular measurements if you want that cinched look. I wasn't really going for the cinched look, but if someone else was making this and that is the effect that they wanted, I don't think I could really recommend this pattern to them, just because you would need to know what the finished measurements are per size in order for you to pick out which size to make, because you'd obviously want to pick out a smaller size, but you wouldn't really know because you don't have the finished pattern measurements. So that's another thing I would knock points off of, because that's really important when it comes to sewing a corset. I do think that this was probably designed mostly for costume, but you could still have a costume based corset cinch you too if that's what you're after. So yeah, that's something to note if you do decide to go ahead and like, tackle this pattern. But overall though, I think it's a pretty solid piece. If you're just beginning, I think this is a really affordable pattern to start with. Of course, there's probably other patterns out there on the market, like free ones and stuff like that, but this is the one that I'm, as of right now, most familiar with. So you do you, of course. But I think if you are looking to try a commercial corset pattern, this is a good one to take a look at. I mean, all things considered, it wasn't a bad make. I mean, you guys just watched me make it. It wasn't bad. You know, there's just a couple of things that I think could be fleshed out a little bit more, but otherwise it was a pretty good pattern to work with, and I will be working with this pattern again. So I liked it. I liked how my piece turned out. I think it's really cute. I think it's really sturdy considering the fact that it's made with, you know, fabric scraps. I think it's really, really cute, and I'm looking forward to working with this pattern for some of my other costume needs this year. So thank you guys so much for watching part 1 and part 2 of this video. I really appreciate all of your views. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your support so much. Please let me know if you like this style of video. I think this is my first time doing a part 1, part 2 kind of a thing, and I'm not really sure like how folks are going to feel about it. So if you like this, please let me know down below, because then I will probably produce more videos like that. So I really would like to do this again if people are into it. So with that, my name is Kia Sangria. You can follow me and my social links down below. My email is also down below too. If you have any questions about the pattern and you know, you need any type of help or assistance, I am more than happy to help you guys. You can also leave a comment down below. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.